It's 6 o'clock. Guess what time that means? It means it's the happy hour. Welcome to the Virtual Happy Hour version number 2 in the COVID Carolina Public Humanities existence. It's been a really, really topsy-turvy few weeks, I'm sure, for everybody. Certainly has been for us. When your raison d'etre is to be doing public programming, this is not a convenient event for sure. But that's the least of everybody's worries. The first thing we should all be thinking about is our own safety and whatnot. And why was the first thing we started a happy hour? Well, we thought, we're not necessarily trying to force everyone to be happy, but we do want to provide distraction. We do want to provide an opportunity for us to talk cheerfully with folks about maybe even some serious things. This is what the Humanistic Project is to make sure we can have dialogue. And if we have to use the technology that we have, I think that we're in a lucky place in the world. If we had to do this in 1918, not many people had telephones in 1918, and I think it was probably a lot more isolating for folks. And of course, they didn't do it nearly as well. So let's hope that the efforts we're putting in will pay off and that we can get through this and be back to normal soon enough. I want to thank a few people in particular before we begin. A big kudos to Paul Benici. Paul is, of course, our communications guru at, he's our communications person. We'll call him a guru. He does a fantastic job with everything. And this has been a whole kettle of fish to get this set up in a way that is responsible, that we don't have interlopers coming in. And there's a lot of technological things on the back end that Paul has been wading through. So thank you, Paul. I also want to thank all the supporters of Carolina Public Humanities, including our longtime supporters like the Cotton Merca Group and Carolina Meadows and the GAA, people you've probably heard me thank many times, and all of our donors and supporters and our participants who keep us alive and keep us going. I want to thank all of you in this time. And to let you know that we're ramping up some events. I want to mention that next Wednesday on April 8th, we'll have a wonderful event. Go to the CPH website, humanities.unc.edu, or on Facebook. And Joanna Sirk-Smith, our new Associate Director for State Outreach, had the luck of joining Carolina Public Humanities on March 16th. And then, but in a very short amount of time, has organized a program on food security during this crisis. So go and find out information for that on Wednesday. We do have a book group that we're going to be holding in May. Plenty of time to sign up for that. It's going to be on, appropriately enough, Camus' The Plague. And we'll have other events as we organize them. So please keep checking in on humanities.unc.edu. We had the unfortunate news today that June is closed down for public events as well. So we're going to be working on making sure we can have a roster of distractions for everybody. Okay, let's get to the topic tonight. Why did we pick drama? Well, first of all, I don't know if you noticed, but this is a pretty dramatic event. Perhaps the largest one I've ever lived through. And certainly when we look at all of the numbers, whether they're jobs numbers or whether they're COVID numbers, these are some pretty dramatic things that we're witnessing. Certainly, we're all stuck inside binge watching, so that's another reason maybe to think about what makes good drama and why drama is a good thing, or theater is a good thing, comedy, not necessarily drama. Why it's a good thing in a crisis like this in which we're all cloistered. There are also, there are no performances right now, so we want to talk a little bit about how theater is coping with that. And there are past precedents and works that might help us think about that, and that's why, in particular, we've brought our panelists together. So let's introduce our first panelist. Is Adam Versényi. Let's see if we can pull up his picture. Adam, there he is. Adam, if you'll unmute your microphone. Welcome, Adam. Adam is the chair of the Department of Dramatic Art and the dramaturge for the Playmakers Repertory Theater, and an expert on on theater in many ways, but also in particular in Latin America. And he's a member of our University Advisory Board, probably the most important thing. So welcome, Adam. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
How are you holding up? Okay?
Doing okay.
Doing okay, good. Well, happy hour is this your first public event since you've been, besides teaching, since you've been in this cloistered existence?
Well, we've been having quite a number of Zoom meetings with our 70 or so folks who work in the Joan H. Gillings Center for Dramatic Art. So.
Okay. Well, it's funny how the world has become Zoom experts overnight. Here we are. Let's thank you, Adam. We'll get to your topic in a little bit. Let's introduce our next panelist today, Mary Floyd Wilson. She's going to appear by magic. Look at that. And Mary, if you will, there's a mute. Mary Floyd Wilson, chair of the Department of English and Comparative Literature, and a wonderful professor, an expert on Shakespeare. And dear friend, Mary, how are you?
I'm doing okay, considering all.
Considering all. Mary, have you baked any cookies in this time?
I have been commissioned by my children to bake a cake this weekend, so
Okay.
I will be baking soon.
There's a little secret. The world's best cookie maker as well. I just want to throw that out there. So yes, absolutely. I'm glad that you're in the happy hour spirit. And finally, let's welcome our third panelist is Al Duncan. Boom! And Al, if you'll unmute your microphone.
There I was with the dramatic entrance.
Yeah, well, exactly. Well, silence. What could be more dramatic than silence, right?
It's actually going to be a mime show coming from me today,
Okay.
so get ready, everyone.
Now, if I'm correct, you might have the youngest children involved in this. How is that? How are you holding up?
Well, I've got a 5-year-old and a 20-month-old who's currently being put to bed right next to me. So we'll see how this all transpires, but they've been the source both of my insanity and sanity over the past 4 weeks. So
well, I think
hopefully there will be no cameos, but if they do, they're very cute.
Well, I might have a cat jump up, as you saw earlier in the testing. So my 23-year-old and 21-year-old have joined my 13-year-old at home. So it's a very different type of vibe in our house, but we've been playing music and having a good time. Al, I want to start with you, and we're kind of going in chronological order. Al is a professor in the Department of Classics, is an expert on Greek tragedy and Greek drama and theater. So Al, what is it? What are you thinking about when your profession, when you come across this situation?
Well, let me start by, I'm unable to share a screen, Max. I have an image I wanted to start off with, if that's possible. And if it's not, then that is okay. And I can describe very eloquently using a craft dialogue, the sort of.
Yeah, or do your mime impressions. I know that our tech person, Paul, is.
Oh, it looks like I now have access. So hopefully
Paul is amazing. Thank you, Paul.
Are you all seeing this?
Yes.
All right, this is what I'm thinking of, and this is what folks in my discipline are saying, that the classics will not save us in this moment of extremity, because so many people, ourselves included, and classics professors are most guilty of this probably, are looking for antiquity, looking for any kind of guidance in a moment like this, something that seems at the face of it so historical, so unprecedented, that makes us hungry, paradoxically, for the precedent. So this wonderful young scholar, Young-in Che, who is currently living in South Korea, so she's got a very interesting perspective on this. She opens up with something that I'll be opening up with by looking at the plague of Thebes as represented in Sophocles' play Oedipus Rex, Oedipus Tyrannus, Oedipus the King. Now, the reason why this is so appealing is it is outside of maybe book 1 of the Iliad, the most paradigmatic plague from Greek literary history. It's a plague that besets the city, that is a direct reflection, unfortunately for Athens, of my second slide, of a real historical plague that beset the city from 431 to 429 BCE. So again, the past is no precedent necessarily, but Athens was in for the long haul on this. So I think we might be thinking about what our falls and 2021s might be looking at in the face of one of these pestilences. Now, the Athenians were in a bit of a bind because, like any plague, this thing wasn't simply biological or viral. There's always a human component in any of these mass pandemics, right? Because we are, ultimately, we can solve the plague, but we're also at our deep core the cause of it. It's because we're a globalized world. It's because we've got global inequality. It's because there's illegal trafficking in pangolins or bats and wet markets in Wuhan. I'm not putting the blame on that location, but that seeing this as a global representation, this pandemic, however much we might want to phrase all of this as a battle against it that we're fighting, it's a battle of our own making. So for Athens, this moment that beset them in 431 was in direct response to the Peloponnesian invasions that began the so-called Second Peloponnesian War, but it's the one that everyone knows about, as documented by Thucydides most famously. But it left scars on the Athenian psyche for many years, and these are probably best reflected than in the story of Oedipus as it's told by Sophocles, Oedipus Rex. Now, Oedipus we know, going to slide 3, and then at some point I'll transition back to my not so lovely mug. Let's focus on Moreau here and the beautiful mug of Oedipus here, and then the Sphinx. I'm sorry, this is a little bit more than PG-13, I'm just realizing.
Well, it's, you know, we're binge watching all kinds of things.
Yes, I know. I'm a few episodes into Westworld right now. Westworld, and that's HBO. Now, to zoom in on just a male nipple, what we're looking at with Oedipus and why his myth is so appealing is because he's a problem solver. He is the person who came in to fill a leadership vacuum in Thebes. Again, one of his own making, unbeknownst to him, he had killed his father, and then by assuming the throne after solving the riddle of the Sphinx, married his mother. We know the broad outlines of the myth, obviously. But part of what attracted Thebes to this man was his ability to solve the unsolvable problems, to address what had for years just festered in the body politic of Thebes. As much as this is a kind of lovely, half bestial monster, the Sphinx is very much a symbol of what might be wrong politically with a state. So Oedipus comes in and is able to offer some clarity to this that raises him to the highest office in the land. But when it comes to solving the plague, and I'm not naming any names here, the leadership has a real problem, and they start looking for experts. They start looking for broader problems. But long story short, because I don't want to take up all of the time of our time together, I'd love to have more conversation. Oedipus is the source of his own problems. And I think that's enlightening for how politicians work, because we see over the course of this play, somebody who enters this unprecedented historical moment, who seems like he's going to be adept, like he'll have all the best people working on it, who's doing all the right steps, because of things like ego, because of things like false confidence in certain assumed beliefs, really starts running astray. And there are voices, whether it's his brother-in-law Creon, there's a bit of nepotism involved. There's more than just brother-in-law, but I'll leave the audience to do the math of the
look at the family tree.
Yeah, the family tree gets a little bit too complicated for my likes. And then, of course, the blind...
The House of Labdacus.
Yeah, the House of Lab. Yeah, everyone's seen these charts, and yeah, you start seeing dotted lines and circles and diagonals that are not supposed to happen in a family tree. We see that Oedipus finally has to recognize that it's his own problem. Now, I don't know if that's going to have any contemporary relevance at an individual level, but I think it does have a lot to say about what we as a society are going to be looking at whenever we get through this, that we're going to be looking for causes. There will be a lot of finger pointing and blame gaming. But ultimately, when we have that one finger pointing out, we got 3 pointing back at us. And I do think that's going to be something that theater is going to be very, and I'll be interested to hear more modern theater practitioners' perspectives on this, that this is going to leave some emotional scarring. This is going to demand some collective healing, especially because these are individual traumas we are mostly feeling at this moment. That collective response of theater, the collective experience, I think is going to be transformative whenever it can happen. And I feel for all the theater professionals who don't know when people, even as things start to reopen, as we start awakening from this, I think people might still be weary about, 2,000 seat, 2-hour performances, or even 200-seat performances. That kind of mass gathering indoors might take a while to rebuild the confidence. But I'm a theater person. That's why you brought me in. But I see this as being a moment. I think
it's a watershed, and
we'll be working through this. Yeah, a watershed.
Certainly, I think a lot of people are thinking about marking time before COVID and after COVID. And when you made these political points about how, you know, it helps people reflect on the polity, not just on their own personal health, but on the health of the entire system. And I think that's a really interesting corollary. You know, the body politic is sick as much as the, you know, people talk about partisanship maybe being solved by this. I'm not keeping my fingers crossed, but you know, it certainly is interesting. Mary, what do you think about all that?
Well, I think it's all very insightful and well put. I mean, I think he's right. I think, Al, you're right, that we are going to be involved in a lot of questions about causation, as you said, and the questions of blame. So, I mean, the way I've been thinking about this is, you know, I think through Shakespeare. And, you know, a lot of, apparently there's a meme going around right now about how we all need to write King Lear, because Shakespeare, you know, purportedly wrote King Lear during a time of plague. I've actually been thinking a lot more about Romeo and Juliet for a number of reasons. I did want to point out how much the theater, as you probably all know, how much the theater in London during Shakespeare's time was really affected by the plague. His own you know, childhood was affected by the plague in Stratford in the 1560s, and then the theater closed in 1593 and 1603, 1608. And so around the time that he wrote Romeo and Juliet, it had just been closed. The theater had been closed for a while. The plague that hit from 1592 to 1593, there were over 10,000 deaths in London, which is a city of 200,000. So really quite devastating. And it's interesting because scholars often talk about how, oh, it's so strange that there's not a lot of plague staged in Shakespeare's theater. And Romeo and Juliet is in fact one of the few plays that directly mentions the plague. If you all recall the plot, the letter is delayed in getting to Romeo from the friar because the other friar, John, is having to stay in a house in Mantua where there's a quarantine. And so he can't actually move quickly because he's there actually to help the sick. And there are actually many ways in which Romeo and Juliet is inflected or infected with the plague. And I think that part of what confuses people who are looking for the plague in Shakespeare is that they're missing what I call plague habits of thought, which is that it permeated the way in which people just thought about their lives so deeply that you don't like point to it as an object, you exist within it. And I think that
Mary, is that sort of like getting used to social distancing and no longer even talking about it?
Well, yeah, understanding that, okay, the theater is going to close at this time, we're going to have people quarantined in their houses. I mean, when people were quarantined during the plague in London, it was for 40 days. And it would be infected and uninfected people in the house together. And
they had terrible bandwidth back then too, I understand. So
they could not be, they were not watching Tiger King. They were not available, none of that was available to them. And I find reading Romeo and Juliet through plague habits of thought really fascinating. I mean, one of the things, you know, if you look at the prologue, and unfortunately I don't have some beautiful pictures for you all to look at.
We're looking at a beautiful picture right now, Mary. So,
well, you're very kind. The prologue itself, if those of you who are familiar with the prologue to Romeo and Juliet, I mean, one of the things that's remarkable about the prologue is not only does it give away the plot entirely, like it really emphasizes that these kids are death marked, right? Fatal loins, they're gonna die. And I think of this idea of being death marked is actually one of those plague habits of thought. The other is the kind of conspiracy of causes that produced the plague. And Al talked a little bit about that, but you know, they believed ultimately it was God as a kind of punishment for all kinds of bad behavior. but they also had, you know, obviously they didn't understand contagion in the way that we did. And so there was an understanding too that your own sin or your own disordered humors or your own deficiencies, et cetera, would draw the contagion to you. They also had, you know, the miasmic notion of bad air.
Yep.
So there's a way in which there's always an interchange between the patient and the contagion that involves questions of guilt and blame. And the way in which the play sort of suggests that all of this death and even the children's death, you know, Romeo and Juliet's death, is kind of a punishment for the parents' strife, is part of that thinking, that there is a scapegoat sort of component to the ways in which they thought about, you know, life and death at this time. I think another way in which the play is really marked by not just the thinking about the plague as an actual disease. It's moving through Mantua, which is right next to Verona, of course. You know, it could attack Verona at any time. Is these ideas of bad air. Bad air is all over the play. I mean, Juliet, when she has to go into the tomb and take this potion and pretend to be dead and be among the dead, her fears are that she will breathe in the bad air and become infected. That's what she articulates at the time. And so that's how they thought people caught the plague, is through the piling up of corpses of the dead and the rotting body, and that corruption of that those bodies then would infect people with the sickness. Now, what I really want to talk about, though, in terms of Romeo and Juliet and the plague, is desire. I mean, this is a play that is not ultimately for us in our memories of it about, so I mean, we know it's about death, right? We know they're death marked, but it's about wanting to catch life out of the jaws of death, right? It's about gather ye rosebuds while ye may. It's about the haste with which Romeo and Juliet want to be together and consummate their love, I believe, comes out of feeling death marked.
Yeah.
They have a haste and rush to them. And I have to say, the other day, so my partner, Lannis, was out taking a walk, and he was talking on the phone, you know, not really paying attention to what was around him. And he noticed some rustling over in the woods. And what he saw were a couple of teenagers who were not social distancing. In fact, there was a pulling up of some pants going on. And it just struck me at that moment. It's like, what are these desirous teenagers? I mean, if I had to do this quarantine existence when I was 16 or 17,
Yeah.
I mean, how are they managing it? I mean, I am very thankful that my 17-year-old and my 22-year-old are both profoundly introverted because they're not like asking to rush out and grab life in the way that young people would want to. And I do think that you know, in some ways we have to see the haste and the rush and the, you know, Juliet was gallop apace, get him here, you know, let's get married now. But it's not just them, it's the parents too. Like, marry her to Paris now. We need to, like, you know, somehow produce life out of this world of death. And, you know, it's not actually disconnected from the plague discourse at the time. I mean, there's Thomas Dekker, who wrote a bunch of plague treatises, actually tells this story, this morbid, awful story about a man who, the plague is raging and he wants to marry his young bride. And so he is concerned he's not going to be able to get the wedding to come off because everyone's occupied with funerals. And so he pushes it and pushes it. And at the very moment in which they are getting married, she drops dead at the altar. And it's this kind of morose, macabre description of how the plague has taken this young girl as, you know, its bride, its death. And that's the image at the end, right, of Romeo and Juliet, in which Romeo believes Juliet is dead, and that, you know, that death itself is her bridegroom.
Wow.
So I do think that sense of the desire for life and the rush towards it, and that, I think it's, it's expressed in so many poems in the period. I know that, Al could probably speak to how we misuse the phrase carpe diem, but this idea of,
Sure.
of plucking, the flowers while you can,
Yeah.
of having life at your hands while you can, I think is, something that maybe those of us who are just kind of trying to get through the day to day are not thinking about.
Mary, when you told me you were thinking about Romeo and Juliet, it reminded me of going to visit my mom and dad who are cloistered, and the way we talk to them is on the balcony. And so I thought, well, there is this element of it as well. So, social distancing, and there's Juliet up there, and she, anyway, that's what I thought of. But thank you. You did ask me, Max. Not everything I'm going to talk about is super happy, but you know what? I'm still happy. I'm still having a good time. I think that's amazing. And I think it is true. Like, when we don't talk about it, like what things have we began to just sort of embody and take on as practices and assumptions in just a few short weeks. Now, if you lived your whole life where plague keeps coming back, I think it would be an undertone that would not have to be explicit. So thank you for that, Mary.
Mm-hmm.
Adam, what did you think about that?
So I'm a theater person, so I've been thinking about the fact that our theater and so many others across the country are closed at the moment. We're not able to do the work that feeds us and that we hope feeds everyone else. And in particular, thinking about our aborted production of Shakespeare's Julius Caesar.
Mm-hmm.
We had, I think, 3 previews, an opening night, and 1 more performance before having to cancel. And how do we then extend that work and everything that we haven't been able to do for the rest of our season? So I've actually written an op-ed about Shakespeare's play, our production, and the contemporary moment, because it's a play that, there was a production at the Public Theater, their production of Caesar in Central Park in 2017, that caused a huge amount of
Oh, I
controversy.
remember, yeah.
Because it essentially painted Caesar as equaling Trump. And what we discovered when we were working on the play, in the midst of yet another election, and now, the chaos caused by pandemic and economic woes, is that it's much richer than a single political point of view. Shakespeare wrote it in 1599 at a time in which English society was very shaky, and Elizabeth was trying to maintain her rule by means of spies and propaganda. It was all very much in flux, transition. We're in a similar period now ourselves. And you can certainly look at Shakespeare's Caesar and say, like Trump, he was born a patrician, yet styled himself the people's champion. He was also an autocrat, out for personal power and even a throne. And if you do look back at that 2017 Public Theater production, Caesar was very much the parallel. They had a heavily styled blonde-haired Caesar wearing a red tie, tweeting from a golden bathtub while he conversed with his wife in her heavy Slavic accent. And he was ultimately assassinated beneath a gigantic US flag by a cast of women and minorities.
Subtle.
Yeah, very subtle. I mean, the cutting the version of the script that our director Andrew Borba did, he purposefully cast both Cassius and Mark Antony with women playing those roles. So in the midst of our quadrennial silly season, when you had presidential candidates like Elizabeth Warren and Amy Klobuchar moving into this traditionally male political sphere, those lines of Caesar, Jan Cassius has a lean and hungry look. She thinks too much. She reads much. She is a great observer, and she looks quite through the deeds of men.
And yet she persisted.
Takes on a very different character, perhaps an Elizabethan version of she's too shrill, unelectable, or in Shakespeare's word, dangerous, when a woman is playing that role. And then following Super Tuesday and Biden's sweep of everything, we get Caesar's assassination with 32 stab wounds that starts to look an awful lot like how moderate Democrats are cutting up Bernie Sanders. And then we have Cassius and Anthony like Russian bots or Facebook trolls or Bloomberg robocalls who are consciously seeking to manipulate the political leanings of the populace and sow discord amongst those in power.
So this is the world we thought we might have escaped with going inside of our homes, but it's all out there in Julius Caesar.
Exactly. So what we end up with, I think, is a kind of Elizabethan version of, going back to Al, the ancient Greeks' exhortation of all things in moderation. What Shakespeare's play gives us is a demonstration of the chaos and the cost that's caused by the kind of violent upheaval and change in Caesar's Rome, and that we ourselves are in the midst of. And that chaos, that cost, that upheaval became even more of our experience when we had to cancel our production.
Wow.
And I think what ultimately Shakespeare's play does is take us on this journey in which we have to decide whether or not to take a stand politically, academically, artistically, in our own personal lives. The question that it asks is, are we passive drones or are we active citizens? And we're the ones who have to answer that question.
And the irony of it all is that an active citizen and someone who is doing their civic duty should be pretty passive right now. Isn't that an interesting irony there? So thank you, Adam. I think that's really fascinating. And I'm so sorry about the loss. You know, we had to cancel our March 28th seminar on dictators, which of course we were going to have Richard Talbert talk about Julius Caesar. And I was going to talk about Napoleon, and I just want to go out on a limb and say Napoleon is more like Trump than Julius Caesar was. And I'm ready to do that in another happy hour. But thank you so much, Adam. I want to bring in our mystery guest now, who showed a little appearance there for a second, and then he went away. But let's see if we can bring him up right now. Our mystery guest. Is he there? Yes. And turn on your microphone. Jerry Davis, welcome. I called you today to see if you could do this. Jerry Davis is the artistic director of Burning Coal Theater in Raleigh, is in the theater business. And I imagine that you're not doing many live productions right now, Jerry.
No, we're not. My little dog Margot in the next room is doing one. So if you hear a bat barking throughout, I apologize for that in advance. But no, we've had to postpone a lot of things and move stuff out of the spring into the fall season, and that's going to make for, if we're lucky, you know, if the pandemic passes, it's going to make for a very busy fall, and if it doesn't pass, then heaven only knows where we're going to be. But right now we have been able to keep everything. We just had to shift it down the road a bit.
Do you think that you'll find yourself thinking a year out, you know, and I guess this is for anybody who's involved in theater, thinking a year out, like what will you do with this as source material? Or will you think, is there a play that you could put on that would be a healing process, or somewhat, what's the right thing to come back with, I guess is the question.
Yeah, I'm not sure. You know, I've been thinking about that. My first thought is that it's probably going to be the last thing people want to hear about. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. One idea that I had was Neville Shute's On the Beach. I don't know if you know that novel from the 1950s.
Sure, it's a nuclear war, nuclear holocaust sort of?
Yeah, it's set in Australia, and they're all waiting. They know when the cloud's going to get there, and so they're kind of trying to go about their lives as if there was nothing unusual happening. And I kind of feel like that we are in that kind of world right now. I don't know if there's a good stage adaptation of the Shute book, or if it's even possible to do that. But that was one thought that I had. And just to tag on to the comments you guys were making about Shakespeare and his continuing relevance. A couple of years ago, I did King Lear down in Wilmington, and was astonished how much that felt like the Trump moment in history. It's kind of amazing. There were certain lines in it, and I'm not going to remember them verbatim now, but where Lear says something about these poor people who don't even have any shelter over their heads in the midst of this storm. Have we missed our opportunity to help them? And so I was thinking, boy, that sounds like a lot of the debate going on right now in the, somebody mentioned Bernie Sanders, the Bernie Sanders camp.
So how running a theater company, what are the, I mean, this is, of course, anybody that's in service industries. We were talking about the loss of restaurant jobs. How are actors dealing with this? And, you know, what kind of support is there for the acting community and the theater community?
Yeah, well, not a lot. You know, honestly, most of the people who identify themselves as actors in this community have day jobs, you know, and so it varies from person to person. If they work in the gig economy, then I'm sure they're hurting pretty significantly right now. But I would say 95% of the people in the acting community, and that goes for designers and stage managers and directors too, in this world, because of the lack of infrastructure in the performing arts, you know, we keep losing buildings, and that means we're never able to build up enough critical mass to really start professionalizing the industry in the way that I would like to see happen. And so that's one of my big arguments right now, is that this pandemic has revealed to us, it's kind of ripped the scab off of the wound of what sort of systems we have in place to support ourselves as citizens through the only collective mechanism really that we have, which is the government, and how little that's serving, particularly in the arts, but not just that. I mean, they just announced today that 6.6 million more people have applied for unemployment.
Yeah.
This week, which means, and that $1,200 is nice, but it ain't going to cover your COBRA cost, if you're out of work. And that's for the ones lucky enough to have had insurance before they got laid off. So we need to reassess the systems that we live under and try to figure out why our representatives are not representing us, because I think that's clearly the case.
I would agree with you 100%, but I'm going to push you back into the world of theater for one moment,
darn.
Jerry.
I spend so much time there.
But what I'm curious, this is something, and I would guess I would just open this up to anybody here, is about the importance of live theater. We've already had to make this adjustment that people are saying, oh, I miss the movies. It's so different to go to the cinema, and that's such a different experience. Live theater and I'll start with you, Jerry, but I want anybody to chime in on this, why it is so important and what are we missing right now by not being able to have access to live theater?
Well, it's a place where an audience can gather to think about the big ideas. I nothing against movies. I like them as much as the next person, but as often as not, they're rather trivial. Or far-fetched and not really germane to the moment at hand. But when you go to a play, you bring into that room that day, you bring that day in the door with you. And so the play is not only about what the writer was writing about at that time, but it is inevitably about what that day was about for its audience as well. And that's a collective thing that's invaluable. And I think people, not yet, because we haven't been away from it that long, but if we stay away from it much longer, I think people are really going to begin to see the value in that and hopefully come running back.
Absence makes the heart grow fonder, right?
So they say.
I think there's going to be a hunger for response. I mean, one of the things that I have found so alienating about teaching on these platforms is that I make a joke and nobody laughs because they're all muted.
Oh yeah, lecturing is useless.
I know, you're speaking into a void. We want live back and forth. We want mutuality. That collective experience is what, life is about. And so having it, be deadened and muted is people are going to hunger for it.
Yeah,
they're going to want it.
It's that give and take that is so much part of the theatrical exchange that we lack.
And was very much a part of Shakespeare's day, and is probably something we've gotten away from a little bit now. But in the best examples, like the Playmakers Theater, there is a moment-to-moment interaction between the playwright and the actors and the audience. It's a three-way conversation.
Are you suggesting we can bring tomatoes to the first live performance that we attend?
If it happens sooner rather than later, absolutely. Bring whatever you like.
Great. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Jerry, for joining us. Jerry, you're welcome to stay on with us and help us answer questions. We have a couple questions from the audience, and now we're just going to have a free exchange here. We've got, out of our hour, we've got about 17 minutes left. So, folks, please give us your questions. I have 2 questions on board right now. Jerry, you want to stay with us and answer some questions with us?
Yeah, I can stay around a little bit longer. If my dog gets too unruly, I'll cut out.
Okay, great. Yeah, if the crowds become too much, make sure you socially distance yourself. Let's see what kind of questions we have here. I'm going to pull up the... Okay, Diane Tyndall asks, hello, Diane. We miss you. Diane Tyndall asks, I don't have a strong background in this area, but why don't we have much theater art about the Spanish flu? Or as Dr. Wilson mentioned, Floyd Wilson mentioned, what are the flu habits of thought that permeated the arts after 1918? Does anyone want to take a stab at that? About maybe theater in the 20s that might have reflected the influenza?
Well, I mean, one thing I would say is that I think there needs to be a kind of longevity to the crisis to create a change in how people think. So, something that happens in a year may not produce the same kind of change in how people think if it's something that happens. I mean, certainly trauma and crisis create changes in our thinking, but I think when it becomes over a long, many, many years, that does something else.
But it is, Diane has a good point. I am surprised. I'm taxing myself to think of a movie or a theater production specifically about the events of 1918, whether it's not the, sort of undertone of, like you were talking about, Mary, in terms of plague underlaying everything, but even just addressing the topic. That's kind of surprising. Is it that plagues themselves don't make for good theater? I'm not sure.
Diane kind of answers her own question, though. I do think that there's probably a way in which the war does sort of,
yeah. There's no shortage of World War I stuff, right?
No,
right.
No shortage of it all.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, we just had 1917, which I think we're all waiting to come out on video because, I might as well watch it now, right?
No.
Jerry, you know of any theater related to the influenza or any plague-related theater?
Well, Peter Barnes's Red Noses is the one that immediately jumps to mind. And of course, there have been stage adaptations of things like The Mask of the Red Death.
Sure.
But I do think that
Camus' The Plague adapted for the stage as well.
Yeah, sure. But I do think the war was probably the thing that, in the same way that when theater is written about our current state, it's likely to be more about Trump and that movement than it is to be about this particular thing.
I just want to say that a panel on the chat, this came up from Ralph Campbell, says that Horton Foote wrote some plays set during the 1918 epidemic as it happened in Texas.
That's right.
That's a playwright I'm not familiar with, but thank you for that, Ralph.
Horton wrote The Trip to Bountiful, which Geraldine Page won an Oscar for, and he also wrote the screen adaptation of To Kill a Mockingbird. He has a play called 1918. I've not read it, but I imagine that might be about that. And he has a whole series of plays called the Orphan's Home Cycle that I think Playmakers may have done.
We did his Death of Papa a number of years ago.
With Ellen Burstyn. Yeah. With
Ellen Burstyn and Matthew Broderick and who else was in that? I'm blanking at the moment.
What's interesting about this and talking about 1918, and Al, I'm thinking of you, it's just how closely plague and war are attached to each other. And of course, one of the things that happens in war is that it destabilizes all sorts of social systems and allows, for the plague to come in often. That connection between plague and war, there it is in 1918 as well.
Yes, and it's worrisome that it can, follow on from a war situation, but it can also precipitate them.
Oh, thanks, Al. It's supposed to be happy hour.
It's supposed to be happy hour, but I think there's a way that whatever the narrative of this will be, and I think we can only speculate at this point. I mean, we're historians and we're literary scholars. We can't really predict the future. We need a Tiresias for this moment. But I think it's always telling that the response to these seemingly biological and impersonal and objective events, right? And I was talking to a virologist friend back from Utah the other day on Zoom, and he was just talking about the kind of chaos theory and the chance of this virus making the leap, because viruses are always mutating. These things are always going. For something to jump to the order of being a pandemic is really, the orders of magnitude of this thing happening are so small. But it's not human for us to think statistically. And I think it's going to be interesting now with what we know about epidemiology, largely as a result of the Spanish flu in the last 100 years of public health and global health, that things like social distancing, we can talk about things like flattening the curve. I mean, how often are we thinking about charts and graphs in our lives as a way of moderating our own behavior?
Everyone's become a data scientist.
Everyone's becoming a data scientist, but of course none of us have. I haven't done the real work for this. But I think that's a very sterile and inhuman response. I think about
with the new curriculum, we'll all be data scientists.
Yeah, I guess that's true.
There you go. We could still kvetch about the old world if we want, Adam. That's fine.
Well, I mean, the way I would translate that into the way we think in literary analysis is that it's this push and pull between determinism and agency, right? We look at these charts, we're like, oh, this is inevitable. This is how, well, where is our agency in this? And so we're told, well, you can flatten the curve, right? You can stay home, and somehow that will affect then the way in which these numbers look. But if you don't, then it's going to be this narrative. And so there is this push and pull, I think, between what humans feel they can do and what larger forces really are at work here.
Well,
go ahead.
Just going back to your earlier question, Max, about how does the theater respond in a moment like this? And we certainly did it before the pandemic occurred, but our whole next season, knocking on wood that we'll be able to open it in the fall, is a season of comedy.
Yes, I knew that. I think that's a fantastic way to look at this. I want to, we can continue with this conversation, because the second question we've already started to kind of address, and it was from Rebel Summer asking about, can we expect a cultural shift? And just like we could see, the Renaissance following the Black Plague, or the 1920s, whether it's World War I or the Spanish influenza or the combination of the two, the 1920s being an age of cultural effervescence. And, I guess the question is, we've started to hint on that, and what would it be, and what would that look like? I mean, I don't know. I feel like there have to be some plays about people doing social distancing in a few years. Don't you think someone's going to set something in this era?
And my hope is that it'll create a hunger for more human connection ultimately, that maybe we won't be on our phones as much after all of this.
Yeah.
But that's just the optimist in me.
I mean, it's funny, they tell us that, here we are conducting this, and we conduct our classes, and people are saying, oh, we're just training for the future of education. And all I feel is absence and lack in terms of that. And I imagine, the theater, obviously, I had an idea, and I put this out there, folks, to anyone. Lloyd Kramer and I have been very influenced by Boccaccio's Decameron and all the different things that people go and they tell stories. And Lloyd Kramer is very much into the idea of the 18th century salon. And oftentimes in the 18th century salon, they would do things like, let's do a reading of a play, or sometimes they'd even put on the production. So we might even consider doing something like that here at Carolina Public Humanities, giving people a chance to, engage in some sort of art together around theater. If we can't do it in front of people, maybe we can do it as people.
Yeah, there's a lot of that going on now. Various theaters responding in that way.
Oh, great.
I
thought I had an original idea, Adam. As I quote 18th century people, right?
With their own communities, but there's also an awful lot that has been put out there in the last couple of weeks that is, quite frankly, not particularly worth watching, as people are trying to respond. This medium, as we've been talking about, doesn't operate in the same way as live theater does.
No.
And unless, and there have been people who have been working specifically on creating virtual theater over the past 20 years. And that's of an entirely different order than just slapping something up on your website or saying, I'm going to stream this performance that was designed for the stage.
There has to be some intentionality when you use these media. Like, I'm intentionally going to create an online experience that'll be different, and I can't sit there and mimic theater and pretend that it's theater when it's online.
Max, have you seen the streamed production of Wild by Mike Bartlett? Have any of you guys seen that yet?
No. Wild by Mike Bartlett.
Yeah, it's the Hampstead Theatre in London did it a couple of years ago, and they actually streamed it then, but they've brought it back this week. It's available through Sunday, and it's a great example of what you're talking about. It's a very talky 3-character play. It's based on the Edward Snowden case, but at the end of it, it ends with this extraordinary theatrical sleight of hand that in person, I imagine, would have just taken your breath away. But when you're watching it in 2 dimensions on a camera, you kind of, or on a television screen, you kind of feel like that the magic of that has been lost. And so it struck me as an odd choice for them to stream in the first place. But I would think that, I was thinking that maybe radio plays or something like that might work better in this medium, where it's more about the language and less about the scenery, you know.
We're not expecting, I mean, you notice how every once in a while we have a little latency in our video and whatnot. Somehow, you know, using, and I'm thinking, Alan, thinking about the way, you know, the masks were used, like someone used this sort of symbolic presentation that sort of slows down. I mean, I don't know enough about Greek tragedy to know about the physical movements of bodies, the terpsichorean aspect of that. You like that?
Yes,
That was a Greek
I do.
reference.
Yeah,
That,
you must have gotten a great score on your GRE, Max.
yeah, exactly.
There's
but I
a
mean, in
wonderful
general, this
piece
notion of
dance criticism called Trepsicordian in Sneakers.
there you go. So I mean, but this notion of like using this medium in a new way to do theater, it would have to be different, right? It would have
to be so different. But I am excited. I mean, that's I want to echo your feelings about loss and absence entirely. There's a way that these Zoom things, and what I really feel is the absence of our participants. They're sending great Q&A. It's lovely seeing all of your faces, but
you can't see them.
I can't see them.
There's Tom Garvey. Hi, Tom.
Yeah. No, and I know there's some familiar ones out there too, and I hope everyone's doing very well, all things considered. But it's to experience, to become Zoom experts, to become data scientists overnight. There's something very exciting for me in all of this, and I've had real good connections via Zoom. I'm rethinking ways of teaching my classes. So
yeah.
Insofar as this has been a complete disruption to everything that goes, and normally I'm not a fan of disruption and those sorts of narrative of that's always generative. This is, one could not have imagined a larger social disruption than this. And I know some people have already brought to bear, what does this mean for the future of climate change, and knowing what collective action at a global scale looks like for solving global problems? Is this, you know, opening our imaginations to possible realities in that? To me, I think, yeah, maybe this will change the way that we interact with people, that we see what works digitally, and maybe go further on that people are actually maybe looking more at their phones because they realize they can do things like this now, which would never have occurred to me before. I would have never done this. I would say, no, I want you to pick up the tab at the top of the hill, Max, and then I'm going to have a drink and we're going to do this. This is wonderful, though. I'm really enjoying the experience.
Well, I think this has been fantastic. Go ahead.
The value of theater. The value of theater has to be skyrocketing right now. Everyone's throwing their money into Zoom as the stock market falls. But I think we're seeing that, no, I mean, Zoom has a place, but it's going to be those real human interactions. It's the making love in the woods that people are going to be responding to at a much stronger level than any of these digital.
They better not be doing that anytime too soon, at least with strangers. I mean,
yes.
Yeah,
exactly. It's got to be someone within your family, which is even harder.
Hey, this is a family show.
I was talking
Greek
about
tragedy.
That was the main thing that my husband had to say when after he saw that, is like, what kind of quarantining is that?
So
they clearly weren't family.
Well, you know, I guess if you're going to bring up Oedipus Rex as your example, it's only fitting, isn't it?
It's only fitting.
So
yeah, he was quarantining before anyone knew.
So Jerry, Jerry and Adam, I got a question for both of you. We're going to have to end here soon. We're coming to the end of our hour. How do you symbolically do a kiss on stage in the age of social distancing? If it comes down to that, we're able to redo theater, but we still have to be careful. What are you going to do about that?
Well, honestly, I think that as long as the language is consistent, the gesture is consistent, I think an audience will accept anything. If you say, I'm picking up a tangerine, and that means a kiss, if you're consistent with that, the audience will believe it and they'll feel something when you pick up the tangerine.
Okay. Great.
Yeah.
I want to go ahead.
No, I would agree with that. It's a matter of establishing the theatrical convention for whatever the action is.
Yeah, I would say, and I just want to acknowledge Ralph Campbell before we leave did mention that he was surprised no one mentioned Angels in America, and that is certainly something we should be thinking about as well. That I think one of the things that's different perhaps in that, and I let the theater folks address that, is, you know, Angels in America, we felt like we were looking at a community in crisis as opposed to a feeling like, well, now where's the art for all of us, you know, in a sense. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I also think that artists in the theater world, at least, always think in 3 dimensions. They always think about what it will look like. You know, when you're writing a play, when you're rehearsing a play, you're thinking about what it will look like. When you're thinking about directing a play, it's not something that's literary. It's something that's human and tangible. And so with the shutdown of the facilities, you know, of the stages, I think we're all having a little trouble imagining art.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah, I mean, a play is a pretext for performance.
Great way of putting it.
It's not a text for performance.
Yeah.
You know, this current crisis has hit us not only in our theaters, but in our training programs. How do you train a theater artist for a theater that doesn't exist at the moment?
Well, I think the answer to that is going to be with Carolina Public Humanities live play readings. At any rate, folks, we have hit the end of our hour. I want to, you know, we've talked about some heavy stuff, but I want to let you know that you 4 have made me feel happier. And I've really enjoyed it. So let us thank our panelists, Al Duncan, Mary Floyd Wilson, Adam Versényi, and our mystery guest, our special guest. Good to see you again, Jerry. And thank you for jumping in like this. We'll be working together again soon, I do hope.
Great.
Thank
Take
you,
care.
Max.
Thank you, everyone
Thank you,
in
Max.
Carolina
Thank you,
Public
Carolina
Humanities.
Public.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Carolina
everyone.
Public Humanities
Thanks
people.
for tuning in.
Yeah, absolutely. And remember, folks, next Wednesday, May 8th, we have another, excuse me, I want time to fly. April 8th, we're going to have another program. Please go to humanities.unc.edu. It's on food security during this crisis. And you'll all get a chance to meet our lovely coworker, Joanna Sirk-Smith. So tune in, humanities.unc.edu. Facebook, follow us. We'll try to do as many online things as we can. To our panelists, one more time, thank you. And to everyone, good evening.
So long.